talking about slavery and anti-slavery. One of the great historians and scholars, just in general, but especially of this period of the antebellum, meaning before the Civil War South, and the Civil War itself, is a scholar named Eugene D. Genovese. And he wrote this book about Christianity in the South, because in America, North and South, most people were Christians, claimed to be Christians, and that played into their lives and their ideas. We may say consistently or inconsistently, but that was the fact. Now, he made this statement in his book about Christianity in the South, and it had to do with this idea that during this time of the 1800s and really into the late 1800s, into the 1900s, and through that time, even until our own day, there began to be this tendency in Christianity to kind of detach Christianity from theology and history. Meaning, historically, Christians have believed things like that Jesus actually bodily rose from the dead, and that he died for people's sins, and stuff like that, that God created the world. And they believed this because they followed what the Bible said. That being said, there was significant challenge in the 17 and 1800s to the authority of the Bible, whether or not it was true and historically reliable. Now, a lot of people started to doubt and question the historicity and the truth of the Bible. And so they started to kind of separate, in many cases, kind of the feeling of Christianity and the morals of Christianity from the theology and the historical claims of Christianity. People started to believe that somebody could still be a Christian, but not necessarily believe that God created the world, or still be a Christian, but not really believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but just that Jesus was a good moral teacher. Okay? During this time, another part of the world, during the Civil War, I believe during 1863, is when Charles Darwin would write his famous Origin of Species. And the kind of paradigm of thought leading up to, including, and beyond that time would pose a challenge to the authority and truthfulness of the claims of Christianity. And so people started to move away from, in many cases, move away from the historic teachings of Christianity and just claim Christianity as a moral system or Jesus as a good example. Now, a lot of people rejected that. They said, no, to be a Christian, you have to believe Jesus rose from the dead. You have to believe God created the world. Otherwise, you don't have Christianity. And so a lot of churches said, no, we're going to continue to believe the Bible. In that process, and just so you understand these things historically, you may be a Christian, you may not be, but in that process, those different beliefs connected with the issue of race and slavery. And this historian, who was not a Christian, Eugene D. Genovese, said theological orthodoxy, meaning following the Bible and taking it literally and believing it literally, he said, emerged as the strongest bulwark against scientific racism. And so what he's saying there, theological orthodoxy means you believe the historic teachings of Christianity as you believe them to be found in the Bible. Okay, that's what theological orthodoxy is. It's distinguished from what's called theological liberalism, that believes there are some good teachings in the Bible, but that it is not to be believed in terms of truth or history. Now, what Genovese, this historian, is saying is that those who continue to believe the Bible, that actually turned out to be a barrier, what he called a strong bulwark. A bulwark is a wall or a barrier against scientific racism. Because during this time, people who were, and Christians who were more prone to the modern ideas of their time that were growing, that Black people, for example, there was a claim that Black people were inferior because they were less evolved. It was Christians who stepped away from their belief in the Bible, where they believed, okay, all people are created and come from Adam and Eve, that were more prone to believing what was called the scientific racism historically. Now, science and racism do not mix together. That's an oxymoron. But scientific racism is terminology for some theories and paradigms started to be developed during that time, which have been proven to be false, but basically under the name of science made claims that certain races were better and certain races were worse. Certain races were more evolved and certain races were less evolved. And these claims started to become part of the thinking of the culture and times in the West. So this led and added more complication to what was going on in regard to slavery, because slavery could be justified on this basis if people believed that the people they were enslaving were less evolved than they were. If that was their presupposition, even though it was wrong, they could justify slavery on that basis. Now, so here's some good news. Peaceful emancipation. Now, emancipation is the freeing of slaves, or the becoming freed from a certain type of system. Peaceful emancipation means that there was no war or violent event that caused it. Now, during this time, if you look at the years over here on this side, and this is from a book called Time on the Cross that has to do with the economics of slavery. Okay, if you look at the years here, and in South America, South and Central America, you see that slavery was being brought to an end peacefully in several places, leading up to, in the United States, the Civil War starts in 1860-61, officially in 1861. And so lots of places were actually bringing slavery to an end peacefully. That happened in places in Europe where they had less slaves now, but these areas had a significant amount of slaves and were bringing slavery to an end. Why didn't it happen in the United States that way? Why did the United States, did it take a civil war? Well, there are a couple of answers to that, but first of all, it's important to realize that a lot of slavery was brought to an end peacefully in the United States. In several states in the United States, before the Civil War and after the Revolution, they brought slavery to an end on their own. However, remember that in the Constitution, there was built in the federal fugitive slave laws that required slaves that escaped from slave states into free states to be returned to slave states by law. Okay, so that created another barrier where slavery was continued to be enforced as well. Okay, so slavery has historically, in many places, been brought to an end peacefully. There were also several anti-slavery societies. 1827, there were 24 anti-slavery organizations with about 1,475 members in free states. Now, in 1827, same year, there is an estimated of 106 anti-slavery societies with 5,150 members in slave states. So there were actually, even in the slave states, it's not like everybody in slave states was for slavery. There were significant groups and movements within free and slave states to bring slavery eventually to an end peacefully. They had different reasons and different strategies for how to do that, but both existed. Now, it actually makes sense that there were more anti-slavery societies and members in the South, in the slave states, because that's where the problem was more primarily located at that time. Now, unfortunately, these anti-slavery societies would become more and more rare toward the lead up and including the Civil War, because there would be some other issues that would heighten the tensions, where basically laws and policies would be made in the slave states that made it very difficult to question or challenge slavery anymore. Okay, this is a document from the time, okay, where this is showing kind of the argument against slavery from some anti-slavery groups, where it basically says here, am I not a man? Am I not a brother? And the argument of this source against slavery is fairly simple, and I think fairly compelling as well, that the argument is on the basis of common humanity. Basically, what this person is saying, representing the slaves, is, look, we're all humans. Am I not a man too? Am I not a brother? Are we so different? Now let's look at some different anti-slavery groups, and we'll start with the most extreme group, which were the abolitionists. The abolitionists, they were kind of started by this guy. They were included many others, but he's one of the big names. William Lloyd Garrison in the North. Now, their statements are not going to sound so bold and wild to us now, but they sounded crazy in the time, and they sounded radical in the time. Now, abolitionists, most people who were against slavery were not abolitionists. Most people who lived in free states were not abolitionists. Abolitionists were a very small, vocal minority against the practice of slavery, and they were a very radical group in their time. And I think abolitionists are an example of real courage, in my opinion, because in the time that they were speaking against slavery, they had the most intense opposition in all of history against them. And they were a very, very small minority in their thinking. And they put themselves at risk by just having these opinions. Often they were beaten up. Often some of them were killed. and not killed by people who were for slavery. They were killed often in free states by people who were also against slavery, but saw them to be so dangerous because of their radical views. Now, why I say also that they are true examples, in my opinion, of courage is because today it seems to me that most people think courage is posting a statement on social media that everybody already agrees with. That in some performative way, just saying, writing something that most people agree with, if not all people agree with, and posting it on social media today is supposed to be an act of bravery or courage. Rather than the abolitionists who were hated and despised by most people. And it took real courage to say what no one else was willing to say during this time. And so they are an example of bravery. Now, it doesn't mean they were perfect either, but abolitionists favored an immediate end to slavery everywhere and no compensation to slaveholders. One of the common ways of ending slavery or common ideas about ending slavery was to basically pay slaveholders to give up slaves. Now, because slavery was providing some sort of economic benefit, the idea was, well, if we pay them that economic benefit, then they can free the slaves. And while that may sound strange to us, it was actually compensated emancipation was actually a fairly successful way of ending slavery. It had happened many times, but it took time. And it took paying people. But the abolitionists said, no, people who hold slaves are committing an injustice. They're committing a crime. And sometimes the abolitionists, truthfully, did exaggerate in their claims of what they said was going on. They, had some propaganda and things that they said were happening that they did not witness or did not observe, but basically wrote out of their imagination. Doesn't mean that they couldn't have happened. It just meant that it was sometimes the case that they did that. But they viewed slaveholders as evil and said, no, not only should we not compensate them, we need to end slavery right now, and we should even actually think about punishing people who have slaves. Now, that was inflammatory language during that time. Now, the abolitionists, most people today would agree with them. That being said, there is a little bit more complication in the fact that sometimes people inherited slaves, and there were laws in certain states about the freeing of slaves that limited people's ability to even do that legally. So it's not to say it couldn't have been done, but it was a little bit more difficult than simply just declaring that this should happen in some cases. But this is considered the most radical position. Garrison published his newspaper, The Liberator, which is an abolitionist newspaper in 1831. Here is his first kind of statement that he made in this document called I Will Be Heard, in this article in his newspaper on January 1st, 1831. And listen to the arguments he makes against slavery and against ending slavery gradually. He says, tell a man whose house is on fire to give moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of a ravisher or rapist. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present, I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Now, his argument is basically this. Lots of people are saying we should end slavery gradually over time. And he goes, no. He says that would be like telling somebody whose house is on fire, hey, we don't want to put this out too quickly. Or we don't want to let people know and scare them, too quickly to let them know that the house is on fire. That would startle them. That would shock them, right? So he says that's kind of like saying, oh, well, we shouldn't end slavery right now. He says, okay, what if a man walks into his house and his wife is being attacked by a rapist? And is he going to go and just politely, tap the rapist on the shoulder and say, hey, I really appreciate if you'd stop, but gradually? No, the right thing to do would be to rescue immediately as soon as possible, take action. And then what if a mom sees her baby's walking around by the fireplace and there's a fire in there, the baby falls in and the mom says, oh, everybody starts running over. My mom goes, wait. We want to take our time with this. We don't want to scare the baby or anyone else. Let's take the baby out slowly and gradually. And that's what William Lloyd Garrison says. Well, he goes, that's what it sounds like to me when people say that we should end slavery gradually, is that we should not free these innocent people who are having an injustice done against them as soon as possible, but that we should take our time and be really careful with it. Now, hard thing here is William Lloyd Garrison's right in principle. The difficulty is, though, that his strategy is debatable in terms of its success. But let's look into a little bit more of what he wanted to do. Now, he's so radical that he wants to end the Union in order to beat slavery. Okay, his strategy works like this. He actually hates the Constitution as well. And he wants secession. Now, we usually think of it as just being the South and slave owners that wanted to secede. But actually, the anti-slavery radicals, the abolitionists, wanted to secede as well. Why did he think that was the case? Well, remember, he hates the Constitution because the Constitution, he believes, makes a compromise with slavery. It requires free states to help pay for and enforce slavery by returning escaped slaves to the slave states. And so he said the only way to get away from this problem is we need to end the Union. We need to separate the United States. And if we're no longer under the Constitution, we can have slaves escape here and not legally be forced to return them. It's an interesting strategy. And it is true that by separating, the fugitive slave laws would not have to be enforced. So this was Garrisons' strategy. He said, I tell you, our work is the dissolution, meaning the breakdown or the separation of this slavery-cursed Union. If we would have a fragment of our liberties left to us, by the dissolution of this Union, we shall give the finishing blow to the slave system. So basically, William Lloyd Garrison thought that, look, it's the federal government that's forcing us to be in a union with these slave states. And it's also forcing us to help pay for slavery and subsidize slavery by returning slaves that escape. Why would free states help to enforce slavery? He says, so the thing that should give the finishing blow to the slave system that would encourage runaway slaves to head for free states, and that would put so much economic pressure on slavery that it would collapse, would be the breakdown of the Union. The states would separate, and either operate as sovereign countries or sovereign or confederacies, groupings of states. Okay. Once the United States did break up in the Civil War, temporarily, that's why the war was fought, is here you see the free states in this color that stayed part of the Union. Here you see the border southern states that had slavery but never left the Union, but were neutral, like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, other states in here. And then here you have the 11 seceding states in red that actually attempted to exit the Union. Now, when these states did exit the Union, they formed their own confederacy, kind of their own version of being states that were united. And they had a president, they had a vice president, they had a constitution. And the vice president of the Confederacy during the Civil War, or shortly, actually, right before the Civil War, said, "I consider slavery much more secure in the Union than out of it." Basically, if these states stayed part of the United States, it was the opinion of Alexander Stephens, who would become the vice president of the Confederacy. He said that slavery is more protected by staying part of the United States than by leaving. Because once it was part of the United States, it had the promise of the Constitution, which promised to return escaped slaves. It had the promise of Congress was working on an amendment called the Corwin Amendment, which we'll look at later, that would have ended the possibility of Congress ever interfering in slavery, which Abraham Lincoln was going to be in favor of, and several states were in favor of, and it had passed in Congress and would have become the 13th Amendment. Also, the Supreme Court would later decide that a slave in a free state was still a slave in the Dred Scott decision. So there were all these things from the US government that were in favor of enforcing slavery. But the southern states decided to secede anyway. And as a result of the Civil War, slavery was brought to an end. But one of the threats to slavery by exiting the Union is that it would end the possibility of the enforcement of the fugitive slave laws, which means that the enforcement of slavery, the costs of enforcing slavery would have been more and more expensive and could have weakened slavery or even caused it to collapse. This is what happened in Brazil. Now, remember, North America did not receive the bulk of slaves that were kidnapped from the western coast of Africa and taken across. It was South and Central America that received many more, and especially Brazil. Brazil, though, was the second. Now, over time, the United States grew to be the largest slave economy, but Brazil was the second largest slave economy in 1825, second only to the United States. Manumission, which was voluntarily freeing your slaves, caused the population of freed blacks to exceed the number of slaves. So a lot of people were choosing voluntarily to free their slaves. Some people did that in the United States as well, but sometimes there were legal limits on that based on the state in which you lived. And whether or not people wanted to do that. So a lot of people were freeing slaves in Brazil, so much so that the number of freed slaves started to outnumber the number of people who were left in slavery. So the government in 1871 of Brazil put together a plan of gradual emancipation. Gradual emancipation is where there would be a plan for a year would be set, and everyone born into slavery after that year would become free by a certain age. Okay, so people born before that year, they would live out their lives in slavery. People born in or after that year would become free after a certain age, or if they were born after a certain year, they would be born free rather than born enslaved. So these were plans for gradual emancipation. It's a compromised plan, but it was a way of that a lot of places put slavery on the road to extinction. Now, in Brazil, there was a division in the North and South about slavery. Slavery became outlawed up here in the northeastern corner of the state. Now, slaves started to escape from the slave region of Brazil to the free region of Brazil. So the government started making laws saying, look, you've got to return anybody who escapes as a slave from the slave regions into the free region. But the laws didn't work. And the having a free region within an overall region where there was slavery basically caused the system to break. Slaves began to escape even though there were laws to prevent it, and slavery rapidly disintegrated. So only a few years, the value of slaves dropped by 80% because this cost of enforcing slavery just became much too high. And then by 1888, the government just accepted what was going on, just said, okay, we're done. Slavery is over immediately. Nobody's getting paid to give up their slaves anymore. No compensated emancipation. Slavery is done. And so it is interesting that in Brazil, there is an example of fugitive slaves escaping from a slave region into a free region, caused the enforcement costs to go up so much that it caused slavery to collapse. Now, that was basically the plan of William Lloyd Garrison and several of the other abolitionists, was that if their states left the United States, they could basically have more slaves escape to freedom and not have to worry about returning them, and that would put so much pressure on the slave states that would raise the cost of slaves so much that slavery wouldn't be worth it, and the enforcement costs wouldn't be worth it, and that slavery would just come to an end.